some great stuff that she wants to talk about. So thanks everyone for joining us for our education conference today. This is the educational theory and practice. This is the session that we're going to do. So right now we are going to listen to Dr. Judy Woosmart. She is from UNL Extension, and she's going to be talking about the role that science educators play in shaping local policy. So Judy, whenever you are ready, you can have the floor.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here and having this opportunity to kind of talk and share about what's been happening, at least in my role, and some of the things in research efforts and extension efforts that we've been doing. So I just want to provide a little background and maybe even a disclaimer that this is not something that I was formally trained on in terms of science policy and even making changes in local policy, but it's kind of fallen into my lap. And so this is kind of a presentation to kind of share some of the background pieces of information that have come together that have kind of shaped some of the local policy that's currently happening in our state. So it's the last 10 years I've been working on a lot of research, mostly related to pesticides and bees. And when I arrived at Nebraska, my appointment is 50% research and 50% extension. So that basically means that I spend half of my time developing research experiments that relate to pollinator health. And then the other half of my time is spent engaging with the public, either the general public, industry partners, growers, beekeepers, and students to engage about pollinator health and conservation. What I think I've learned in this last few years is that as scientists, we learn a lot of information in a very condensed period of time. And so it's very easy for us to just assume that things that are common knowledge to us is common knowledge to everybody. And so, one of the most common mistakes I find is that students in my lab and other people who are learning at this very rapid pace tend to just overthink things. And when we ask the simple question of what do honeybees do? Why are they important? Maybe our thoughts instinctually go to pollination and food production, but most often people have not related that what we quote unquote think of as common knowledge as bees are pollinators. Really, their first answer is, well, they make honey and I like honey. And so a lot of times you have to, just work with baseline information, make sure that these complex pieces of information are distilled into digestible pieces. And I think most of that comes down to simplifying your take homes. It's really easy to get lost in the weeds, the details. So I find it really helpful to just focus on the science. And that is just clearly what information do we know and what do we not know? And when we talk about these circumstances and these situations. So bees and pesticides is a really controversial topic. It's really heated. There's a lot of invested interest and a lot of stakeholders that have informed opinions one way or another. And what I've learned that is it's really complicated to talk about pesticides and bees because there are situations that cause individual impacts on an individual bee versus situations where it's affecting the entire colony because these are social insects and they rely on one another. But there are also these really nuances in which pesticides can affect them directly or indirectly, causing these cascading effects where they're maybe altering their behavior or their habitat reproduction in ways that make other things start to get out of line or out of balance in terms of pests or pathogens, things like that. So there's a number of things that can complicate a scenario, but basically the real gist of it is that our regulatory policies, our protections for pollinators really assesses whether or not these chemicals kill a bee. Is it a bee kill? Is it a pesticide kill? But newer compounds and things that we're trying to relate to the public is that these chemicals might not directly kill the bee, but cause incidences. And what we call these pesticide incidences are things that cause problems with their behavior, the development, the reproduction, or habitat in ways that make them unable to survive. So this is a perfect example of a video taken in one of our experiments. This is a normal functioning small colony. You can see lots of bees, busy as can be, flying in and out of the hive, collecting resources. When I pan over to the other colony, this colony is given a very small dose of a pesticide-treated sugar syrup. And it's not enough to kill the bees, but you can certainly see that they're not functioning normally. Their locomotive behaviors, their cognitive behaviors are all hindered in one way or another. Basically, you can tell that there's not enough foragers coming in and out of this hive to collect the resources they need to produce the offspring or the population. And so surviving a winter like in Nebraska without the proper food stores or the bee population is really going to end up killing that colony. So the take home from this is that a pesticide doesn't have to outright kill a bee to harm the colony. This is the messaging that we've been really trying to focus on when we're working with regulators and even with just the general public, is we don't have to see the dead bee to know that the colony may or may not be harming, or know that the pesticide may or may not be harming the colony. We really have to look at it holistically as a whole system. And that means that we have to estimate risk. What is the risk to pollinators? That means that, well, we have to get down to kind of really some really complicated areas of toxicology where we're trying to figure out, well, is it going to kill them? Is it not going to kill them? Are they being exposed? Where are they being exposed? So these are the fundamental questions that we kind of have to pose to the public. You know, before we can actually decide, are these bees dying from chemicals, we need to know where they're being exposed. Even if they are in the landscape, they may not be bringing it back to the hive. So what does it mean in terms of contaminants and pesticides and nectar and pollen coming back? And that's a really a big problem for beekeepers and those that don't understand bees, is that when bees are exposed to chemicals in nectar or pollen, they may not be distributing those compounds thoroughly and evenly throughout a colony. For example, you can see these pictures of the bees carrying back pollen, which is a protein source for them, on their legs. Those foraging bees are not consuming it and will probably not be exposed to the contaminants in that pollen. But when it comes back to the hive, the nurse bees, the bees that are taking care of the brood and the offspring, are consuming pollen so that they can take care of the brood. If you lose all those nurse bees, then there's going to be detriments to the hive that may not be as relevantly notable, because it's a very small portion of the bees. When we first came to Nebraska, or when I first came to Nebraska and started research, I really wanted to find some sustainable solutions that could work for beekeepers and farmers. And to promote biodiversity of pollinators and beneficial insects in a system, it's always encouraged to plant more. You know, the more plant diversity, the more habitat you have, the easier it is to support a wider diversity of species. And so the concern here was that if we are planting pollinator habitat right next to cornfields, right next to agricultural systems, is there going to be drift or movement of these chemicals into those habitats? So we were trying to see if placing habitat behind non-attractive trees could serve as a drift barrier or a trap to prevent contaminants from going into these habitats. Unfortunately, at this site, was having consistent problems with bee losses. We were just unable to keep bees alive. No matter when I put the bees out, how I put the bees out, we started to notice these chronic and persistent losses. And these would be what you would consider classic acute pesticide poisoning symptoms. So then it took, as a new researcher in a new location, if you can't keep bees alive, how are you supposed to conduct research? We had to completely shift our focus of our program to look at, well, what are some ways we can encourage beekeepers like ourselves to investigate a potential pesticide exposure or poisoning? In the image here, you can see that there's losses of bees here, but it's really hard to tell inside the grass. So we use these really easy constructed monitoring tools to teach beekeepers how to monitor for their losses, when their losses occurring, the seasonality, the duration, the rate. This was going to help us determine which farm practices were causing our exposure losses. So the next few years, we spent taking samples and trying to figure out exactly when and how these bees were dying. And from these traps, depending on where the bees were, we were actually able to determine that some of the losses are associated with particular spray events, like this fungicide spray that happened early in spring at this orchard, versus kind of mid-season potentially pest control treatments that are happening in the middle of an urban area. The agricultural setting at NREC, this is where we were having massive die-offs. The die-offs were occurring pretty chronically and throughout the season. And this was going to show in various symptoms. This is prolonged potential exposure where these bees are starting to just decline. You're seeing lots of dead bees, partially developed brood. This is an image, this is a video of the bees in the hive. They are jittery. This isn't the video. So they're acting kind of jittery or trembling. You also notice that the brood or the larvae are not well cared for. And for beekeepers that are experienced, you would expect to see a big pile of food under that in that cell with them. So you're starting to see brood diseases, but we aren't able to associate whether or not those brood diseases are caused because of the chemical exposure or because of a lack of brood care or a lack of nutrition. So it's extremely hard to tease out all of these things. But what we do know is that from vegetation sampling, we found extremely high levels of these chemicals in plants. And this was in milkweed plant leaves, between 3,000 to 5,000 parts per billion. In those videos earlier, you noticed that those bees were pretty much impaired at 50 parts per billion, a very low amount. So we reached out to NDA and EPA to really determine, well, is there something going on with the water system that can explain why we were seeing higher levels within plants associated with the waterways, but when we move closer to the crop field here, we'd see lower levels. So this kind of informed us that maybe there was something going into the water system that we needed to look into. What I didn't realize was that because we had ruled out on-farm practices that were occurring nearby, the Department of Ag couldn't help us because this sits outside of FIFRA. It was not a misuse of a pesticide application. It sits in a gray area. So we couldn't get assistance from the state or EPA to help us with these pollinator investigation or the losses of these. We were asked to kind of put out more hives and to help try to figure out and charged with identifying where the bees were getting it, which compounds, at what levels and where. So you can imagine the amount of sampling that needs to be done in terms of the bees, the food stores, the water, the soil, and the vegetation all around, and where and when to sample. This was going to be extremely difficult to do. But we tried to, play along, and we put 12 additional colonies out, and immediately within a week, we started seeing these losses. So now we've got a lot of dead bees, a lot of contaminated resources, but not enough funding to do any kind of work with it. On the right, you can see images of all the other cities that we had bees being housed with that had very, very little losses or nothing like this that we were seeing at Mead. The other concerning thing is it wasn't just the beehives, but we were actually seeing wild insects, bees that you could pick off of the plant, or dead bees that were feeding on the water guttation or plant guttation for water collection, dead in the field itself. And what this was really highlighting is that there's this concern for systemic pesticide pollution. I want to define that because this isn't really a common term. It means that there's these systemic chemicals, and this includes the neonicotinoids and several of these fungicides that are used in treated seeds. These compounds can move in the water, into the soil, and through the plants. It can translocate to all parts of the plant, but it's expressed differently in the leaves, the nectar, and the pollen, and the roots. But this is where a lot of our bees, as well as other wildlife, may become exposed. To my surprise, there's no regulatory division at EPA to address this kind of pollution. We've got robust regulations in water, air, and soil. And we've got decades of research showing that these compounds can move into non-target plants and to systems that we don't want them to be in or intended. But to my surprise, there's no division that is collectively looking at this as a whole. And so as a result of this, what's happening in Nebraska, there's internal discussions happening now. So going back to what we do as scientists and the roles that we play, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that we aren't trained to communicate our science. We are trained to do and conduct and report the science in peer-reviewed articles and journals. But in terms of communicating it to the public or to legislators, that's not something we're trained to. So it was definitely a huge learning curve, not only to understand what needs to be done in the system, but how do you communicate those? Because they go hand in hand. I very quickly realized that Because I was the bee researcher that kind of threw up a red flag in the system, a lot of folks sought me out for answers to everything. So it was very critical that we started to develop partnerships and collaborations with other scientists, educators, industry partners, advocates, policymakers, people who might be more familiar and with what was happening in the processes of ethanol production. So when I started to come in and start recruiting people, it was really important for me to be clear on my role. This is what I could provide to the table. This is my body of knowledge. I focused on the science, and I was able to provide, well, this is the literature and the body of research that I've contributed or reviewed that I can inform. But things that are things that they wanted to know is my health in danger? What about my pets? What about the birds that I'm seeing? And all of these questions are really difficult for me to answer because I'm an entomologist. That's not the role that I play. So the thing that we needed to do was reach out to our partners, our existing partners. A lot of them were the national partners we worked with related to neonicotinoid research. And I was reaching out really to figure out if they knew anything about treated seed disposal. Is this happening anywhere else? We need to kind of rely on existing data or body of literature to kind of reference ourselves. What are the residue levels that you would see if this happened in another place? And to my surprise, the issue of treated seed disposal has never come up prior to this. Within all of these organizations and even within the states, that was not a discussion that was on their radar. And from the national discussions, I was able to then start figuring out who were the local chapters that we really needed to work with, who were the local players that could help us with boots on the ground action. And as before I continue, these partners play incredible roles that continue to do things, to move things progressively forward that I couldn't do. For example, Lucas Rhodes and Daniel Rochelle from NRDC, these are environmental lawyers that were able to utilize their expertise to put this in the public document. So when we first discussed this in June of 2020, the EPA was currently closing a review of neonicotinoids, the entire class of insecticides. And so they were able to put this public document together to show that this is something that needs to be dealt with immediately. And so I was grateful for them to kind of get that in that realm, because that's not something that I had time or the expertise to put together. But as we started to work with these partners, some of them were working on these public documents and putting public statements in. Others were digging into the public documents available through NDE as well as NDA. And it looks like this site was doing some incredibly unregulated things, including stockpiling the pesticide contaminated waste outside with no protective measures from runoff or leaching. So this was last summer, and this is the spring. As you can still see a lot of snow melt and a lot of runoff potential there. This last year has been a lot of Zoom meetings and discussions, and really seeking out people who may have more information about how disposal of treated seed typically occurred prior to this. So the question really is what happened before Altent and what is going to happen after Altent? And there still really isn't a lot of answers here, unfortunately. From the sky view, you can see that the wet cake piles were in 3 stockpiles for several years. And even from this satellite image, you can see where the hoop houses were containing large supplies of this surplus seed. So for those who are not familiar with this story, I've kind of talked about it in different avenues already. This ethanol company is a unique company that was utilizing crop seeds, surplus, unused, treated seeds as a primary source of ethanol production. And as a result, there was a lot of corn and other crop seeds, harvested grains processed through this facility over the last 5 years. And one of the things that have been brought up in the discussions was that there's been a lot of flooding in the Midwest in the last few years, and that might have also cause a large number of surplus of products, but we really don't know what the estimates of how much was processed through this facility. Even the Google satellite images show the green tint of that pesticide colorant that was added to those treated seeds. And last year, the water results show that there was residues as low as 28 feet in a well on the site. Unfortunately, the problem gets worse as we keep digging into the situation, because in 2018 and 2019, 66,000 pounds of it, I'm sorry, 33,000 tons of it were land applied or used as a soil conditioner to local farmers without their knowledge. This includes a lot of these neonicotinoids as well as fungicides and herbicides, where we don't really have a strong understanding of what those toxic mixtures are going to do in terms of their impacts. There was a stop issue released in May of 19, and that was because the Department of Ag estimated that what they were recommending as an application rate would be 85 times higher than the maximum annual field load allowable by a registered pesticide label. Unfortunately, this wasn't registered as a pesticide product, and so there weren't pesticide testing requirements done prior to this. Even with the stop use, there was documentation that this company was discharging the wastewater to local farms. These hoses extend 2 to 3 miles off property. And the community members have been complaining for years. This has been documented in social media and in their community chat rooms and blogs for several years, showcasing sick pets, dead geese, swollen eyes. When we finally got a hold of state agencies and an offer, it was quite a confusing process, because the regulatory officials must work within their own divisions. So even though I was communicating with one person, it didn't mean that everybody was aware of what was happening. I had to reach out to NDA. They were specifically working on those soil conditioners or the applications to the farmlands. They suggested I can connect with NDE, who was working on contaminants in the water, the air, and the waste. However, it took a very long time for us to figure out who within NDE is working on this. There was a lot of cold calls and a lot of voice messages left. And surprisingly, when we finally got a hold of NDE and asked them what could we do to help with them, they said public awareness. Public awareness was needed for their agency leaders to become more responsive and to have a little bit more transparency or information flow across divisions. I also found it extremely difficult to recruit researchers to investigate because people were unaware of what was going on. So the summer of 2020, we contacted a lot of media outlets, and unfortunately, there was a lot of interest, but from the editor's standpoint, there was too much going on with the elections, with COVID, and with protests going on that summer. There just wasn't any room for that. We continued to seek help, and through those connections, we found that this company, despite all of the violations and warnings, was still distributing solicitations for more clients. And they were still touting a green recycling program, saying that they were land applying all these byproducts accordingly to their permits. And what I think needs to be showcased is the fact that they were self-touting. They were processing 98% of all discarded treated seed in North America. So consider how much crop production happens just in the Midwest alone, and then amplify that for the entirety of North America, over 100 producers. That's a lot that potentially came through our state to dispose of this pesticide contaminated product. And Carrie Gillen took this story on because she previously did a story on this, because it was initially supposed to be a closed loop circuit where the Mead cattle facility was going to power the ethanol facility, and the ethanol production was going to produce distillers grains to feed back to the cattle. So this closed loop system was going to be a really nice green system. It didn't work out, and the company changed ownership in 2015, and that's when this started. So after this article, this was what really brought us to be able to take some immediate action, and the plant was shut down. We started to get a lot more research, research interest and partners interested in partnering with the research aspects of it. A week after it shut down, there was a huge rupture of the digester, releasing a ton of waste down the road. And so it was really dependent on the local journalists at that point to help continue to follow the story and keep the company accountable, and as well as the state agency accountable for helping with this. The late season of this, June of this year, Altent Facility Response Group was formed. This is the coalition of seed companies that had used this company prior to. They took on the lead to clean this effort up. But Chris Dunker from Journal Star estimates that there could have been over 1 billion pounds of this treated pesticide seed that has passed through our facility. The other thing that we really have to consider is, we're unable to determine really good estimates at this time, but now that it's shut down, the need for disposal is going to persist. So while this is a local issue, there are national implications to this process that we have to continue to explain and bring to the public light. This is what it looks like out in the field. Dr. Marian Ellis was my predecessor, did a wonderful job seeding the site with beautiful pollinator-friendly forbs, including, clovers and vetches and milkweeds. Unfortunately, the bees can't survive in this landscape, and I think it has a lot to do with the runoff from the wet cakes. This was this March. You can see the amount of waste that is on this property, and the soil berms that they've constructed to prevent runoff are being reformed each time it's breached. So there's really not a good sense of whether this is working or whether it's keeping residues from leaching into the soil. So are there protective measures and mitigation actions working? We don't know. And this is just showing the volume of wastewater that comes through when there's heavy rains. This was March. We also had a number of heavy rains in the fall. And each time the wet cake piles decrease in height and size, and that worries me a lot, because the amount of water that's traveling through the system is making the impacted area quite large. They have placed some plugs into these culvert systems, but there's a number of these waterways that we have to kind of monitor. The February spill created a lot of water on this property, and as you can see, there is a lot of migratory birds waiting in the spill only briefly. When you approach it, they fly off. So impacts of this kind of short-term exposure is unknown. But they're certainly feeding and waiting in this wastewater, and that can't be good. So we really need to do a good job as scientists to explain who's at risk and how do we know. And that was something that was the first thing we had to do through town halls and lectures, to really explain who is at risk here. In order to do that, because that's what people want to know, are we at harm? We can't do that without knowing where's the highest risk, exposure risk. So that's what we've been trying to explain is these organisms are not going to be impacted the same. Bees and other insects might be more exposed through plants and air, but we've got aquatic organisms that are going to be more exposed through water. So the first thing is we need to find where the chemicals are so we know who's at highest risk. The other thing I need to point out to the folks is that there's a lot of these critters that have a lot of evidence. There's a lot of literature that shows they're highly sensitive, that effects may occur at low doses or after acute exposures. But then we've got mammals, like ourselves, that tend to be less sensitive. Effects may occur at high doses or after prolonged exposures. But we also have to consider the fact that while we've got these more sensitive critters, the less sensitive critters also have more knowledge gaps. We just don't know a lot more about them in terms of impacts to a population or to a community, because these are harder, more difficult organisms to study in the field. So simplifying the complexity, I think, helps overall understanding of the issue. This allows us to kind of target action steps and solutions for it. So even though a lot of times people don't really care about bees, to be honest with you. When I tell them my bees are dying, they're like, well, one less stinging insect, it's not a big deal. But we have to consider that's the messaging mishap, right? If I didn't explain to them why that's important, then I didn't do my duty. And really, I think of moving away from, it's not about the bees, it's about the fact that these are bioindicator species. And even if they are more sensitive, the loss of these insects means the loss of food web support. The loss of food web support is going to have an impact on these animals, probably and longer down in the road. So we've got this differentiation between short-term monitoring of bioindicator species and the need to do long-term monitoring for these others. The take home is really, it's not about the bees. Your messaging has to be relatable and relevant to the audience as a whole. And so that's what we've been trying to do, is that I'm clearly going into this knowing that a lot of people don't care about bees, but maybe they do care about the wildlife, the local wildlife that are feeding on the dead bees, as you can see on the picture on the left, or the birds that are acting very weird in the system. They're either malnourished or cognitively impaired, but the bird right here on my right is clearly unaware of my presence, as well as the technician right next to me. And so these are the things that we really are interested in looking more into. So with the public awareness and the social media and the media efforts, we've been able to recruit this incredible team of response team, which includes a bunch of public health experts from UNMC, as well as environmental experts, ecotoxicologists, water experts, soil experts, and air experts from UNL, Creighton University, as well as the Nebraska Water Science Lab. And so in addition to that, there's Dr. Van Warmer and I are trying to develop a team that can look at more of these short-term monitoring and long-term monitoring species. So it's a very complex system. And in order for us to answer who's at risk and who's going to be in harm's way, we first have to determine where the exposures are. Is it in the air, the water, the soil, the vegetation, where and what levels and when, before we can answer all of these other ecological impacts questions, as well as human health questions. So that's the route that we're taking. However, as the role of scientists, you're out in the system and you're trying to work with what you have. The lines are what we thought as the major flows of these paths, but this is a culvert that is here at Fire Shop, where I've circled here, and is in yellow or in the red star. And surprisingly, I'm finding culverts that are not in our area that we thought would be a runoff path, exhibiting high toxicity. So here's a thistle that's right at the base of a culvert that is exhibiting dead insects of every insect order. And this is unique because people who are in pesticide toxicity studies or in this field understand that even within bees, different species are not equally sensitive. So in insect world, there are certainly beneficial insects that are more sensitive, but there's also pest insects that are quite resilient. And here we see beneficial predators like lacewings and wasps and ants, as well as your more robust pest species like ants and bugs, all dead from contact of this plant. Then you see the bees flying, engaging, and then flying off again. So this is definitely concerning as a whole. And I think all of our efforts, and I think the point of working with the community leaders, the state officials, and the regulators is to understand that all of the focus currently is on site where that little blue star is. But the research team has started to uncover potential impacts as far as 6 miles out, including sick pets, sick people, dead bees, and fish kills. This is a farmer who lives 6 miles away, who has a catch stream, a pond. This is his pond right here. It is at the receiving end of all this runoff. And they called me up last summer to check out a pair of dead beavers on the outfall. Now their pond connects to Clear Creek, which then connects to the North Platte. So we think that the beavers came up the Clear Creek and entered their system and perished there. But this is kind of showing you the extent of the massive need to investigate offsite problems. And that can't be done by one researcher or even a team of researchers alone. When we sample the, thank you. When we sample the soil, we find that these chemicals are still pretty high, even 2 years after being out in the environment. I think there's going to be a lot more work that needs to be done. You can see the excessive rain in these compounds or in these areas, and then boom, what replaces the rain is big blooms of forage, which is going to be where the bees, the butterflies, and wildlife are getting their food. We're seeing monarch larvae, caterpillars dead, feeding on these plants. And the question is, where are they? Where are these hot spots? And how long are these impacts going to occur? So it is a kind of a alarming situation. I think one thing that we need to point out is where policy or actions can be improved. The EPA says that there's no, because there's no uniformity limit or amount, we really can't conclude whether this is going to cause adverse effects. And I think that that can't be the end of the story. We need to have someone go in and assess whether or not there has been effects, given that this has happened. So just to kind of finalize, we all have a role to play. I mean, this is just a snapshot of the beekeepers in our training program. For us to relay this message to them, they relay it to their constituents and so on and so forth. So this has to be passed on. And the key message that we relay to everybody is that the bees are bioindicators of our environment that can help guide us to become better stewards of our land. I don't think anybody will disagree with that. And so this is something that we get common ground that we can work on moving forward. Journalists like Chris Dunker has been great at helping me piece together things like the tornado damage that caused our honey house, near missed our honey house. But I just wanted to just show and highlight some of the other faces behind the scene. And as a role of a scientist, I think the other thing we need to do is be mentors for our students, for the staff and the students that come and work for us in our labs. One of the most highlighting, I think, things that I've come across is that most of these students and staff that come in are interested in science adjacent fields. They don't want to be researchers. They don't want to be faculty academics, but they want to be informed on how science happens and how to get into conservation and how to get into these science adjacent fields. And I think that is an incredible area that we really need to foster and develop more. How do we train these future generations to be equipped in receiving scientific information and distributing and communicating that in ways that are relevant and important? And that has to be done in all realms, not just in the science policy, but just our general outreach. We also need to make sure we give credit where credit is due. So the industry has done an incredible job at responding, canceling their contracts, seeking alternative measures, trying to help clean up the mess that's happening right here in our state, as well as make updates on disposal guidances. So this is this Pesticide Stewardship Alliance Special Task Force. They're trying to determine what are options in other states. And I think one of the most interesting things that came out of working with this group is there are robust regulations on hazardous waste, even pesticides. But when in the life of a treated seed does it be considered hazardous waste? And that is really because of this federal exemption or loophole that has caused the treated article to fall out of these regulations. So just lastly, I just have 2 more slides, I think. I just want people to know that this is an area that really needs to be dealt with, because the company itself was arguing that they don't produce a waste product. It's economically viable, so they don't need to produce a disposal plan or a protection plan. And so there was a number of years where that was the contention. We don't produce waste, so we don't have to do these requirements. And that, again, comes down to this language and the exemptions that have caused the confusion. Everything that's happening in Nebraska is starting to permeate across the industry. Farmers are starting to reevaluate the use of treated seeds. There are also agencies like the Center for Food Safety that has put legal action to sue EPA on unlawful delays and regarding their responses to regulate treated seeds. And again, locally, we need to keep going. We need to continue to help protect the community members. And I want to end with crediting this group. Perry Valley Group I'm a member that helps, inform these community leaders, but they are the ones that are creating the Alten Crisis website that puts all the information accessible for people. Janice, Lisa, Al, they've been incredible at making the state agencies accountable and really staying on top of things. Mark Hefflinger, who is from Bold, Nebraska, has provided water filters to concerned citizens. So these are really the people who are doing stuff to make changes happen. And just last week, Lisa informed the public that they were trying to sell some of their byproducts to a landscaping company in Kansas. And because of their ability to highlight this, that sale was disrupted and canceled before it can happen. So ending, this is what's happening in our state. We've got a ton of legislators that are interested in helping improve this to make sure it never happens. Senator Blood has been incredible supporter of the group and been putting some proposals that will make a difference. And this has also been interest that is taken on in other states. But again, like the speaker before mentioned, you have to be accessible as a science educator, as a scientist. You have to be accessible to answer these questions. So we've had a number of interviews, questions, emails from beekeepers involved with legislators in these states, as well as other supporters. But my message has always been this: a ban on neonics is a conversation stopper. We cannot do that as a strategy. It has to be state specific. We have to conserve the chemicals where it's necessary for food production and reduce use where it's not a benefit. We should re-examine them and their uses in urban areas and really promote the reduction of cosmetic purpose, pesticides used for cosmetic purposes, so we can conserve the tools that we need for food production. That's it.
All right, thank you, Judy. That was really good information. Does anyone have any questions? We have a couple more minutes. You can either unmute yourself or go ahead and add them in the chat. There's some great conversations going while you were talking, Judy. Thank you for that. Just a lot of thank yous. All right, well, we have a couple more minutes. So if you think of a question, please feel free to add that. I had a couple people ask me in a private message if this is going to be recorded. Yes, they are going to be recorded. We're not exactly sure where they're going to go. Most likely